Well, welcome to the Managing Innovation podcast, and we're delighted today to have with us Zach Rattner, who has a very impressive career in the field of innovation and entrepreneurship. Currently, he's a co-founder and CTO of a company called Yembo, which is growing fast in the fascinating space of using AI. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment, Zach. But he's also the author of a book called Grow Up Fast, which is full of really rather valuable lessons for would-be entrepreneurs and indeed established entrepreneurs as well. So Zach, welcome and thank you so much for sparing the time to talk with us. Maybe we could begin by asking you just to sort of take the helicopter very briefly back over where you started. In particular, one of the phrases on your website, you talked about moving from an employee mindset to a founder mindset. So that's quite intriguing. But could you just give us a bit of a thumbnail sketch of Zach and how he's got to where he is right now in the entrepreneurial field?
Sure. First off, thanks for having me. Happy to be here. So I can give you a little bit of background. My upbringing, my education was in engineering. I studied computer engineering. I went and worked at a big tech company. And all along the way, I always was interested in doing a startup, but I wasn't always sure if now was the right time. And what happened was there was an opportunity that I saw come. My wife was working at a moving company, and I was learning about the advancements that were happening in computer vision. And this is back in 2016 or so. And the best computer vision algorithms got better than people at identifying objects in images. So there was an academic benchmark where you can think of it like a 1,000-way multiple choice test. If I hold up a picture and say, what is this of? And it's almost commonplace now here in 2023, but there was a day where those algorithms weren't very sophisticated, and a lot of times they would make silly mistakes that a human would never make. But the pace of innovation was just growing, and it seemed like very few people understood what the implications of that technology were. It was kind of relegated off to the corner in some um, industry and academic publications, and self-driving cars were taking advantage of it. There were these a lot of drone companies, last mile delivery kind of problems that were being kind of I would say over focused on in Silicon Valley. And what I wanted to do was take these advancements in an industry that was not going to see it coming, that kind of this rising tide raises all boats. And we wanted to see what are some other things that people haven't even really thought of yet. And that's where my wife's background gave me the inspiration to see in the home service space with things like moving or other related industries like plumbing, property insurance, painting. Usually, if you want to get a quote, you can't just go on the website and look at what the job is going to cost. You have to have someone come to your house and walk around and identify what's there. And we realized we could use computer vision to help that industry where we can cut down on the drive time. We can let the person who's doing the sale focus on the more human elements of the sale and spend less time sitting in traffic. And we built a product that allows a similar output from what the current workflow provides, but it's a bit more higher resolution. We don't just say, hey, your move will be so many cubic meters or so many pounds. We just can show the actual items in addition to what the summaries are. And what we found is it's just a much more efficient and effective process. So where people could do maybe 2 or 3 surveys in a day beforehand, they can do 4 or 5, 6 now. We've also seen other clients expanding their business in places where they couldn't afford to drive maybe 200 miles to go survey a client's property in a different town. But if you're using computer vision, you can, and you take the uncertainty out of it. Because when I'm driving to your house to do a survey, I don't necessarily know, are you going to book with me or not? So I have to burn the fuel, I have to spend the time, and I have no guarantee that I'm actually going to win the business. But if you do that over technology, you can drive out there when you know you have the job. So it changes the economics of like profitability and all these kinds of things for our customers.
Wow. And from the look of it, it's growing well. It's obviously got a lot of satisfied customers and a lot more interested ones. But what's intriguing me is you said this was, you'd wanted to do something as a startup. You sound like you've then jumped fairly much into the deep end. So could you tell us a bit about how the first bit of the swimming went? Perhaps
Sure.
to use, yeah, go ahead, please.
Sure. So I think it's easy to look at folks in positions like mine, and it almost looks like a linear straight line. And that's because you don't see web pages about the ups and the downs and the anxieties and the decisions. You just see the end result. Um, so I ended up doing what I look back on now. I call it my professional gap year. And what I did was I was working at a large company, knew I wanted to do a startup, but the problem is with a startup is everything is on you as the founder to kind of get it up and running. So you have a great idea. Then as an engineer, writing the code is relatively easy. But if you want to switch your job, you need customers, you need go to market channels, you have vendors, you have partnerships, you need employees. And it can take a long time to set all these kinds of things up. So I didn't want to be delusional about it. Like, oh, I have a cool idea. I'm just going to like take the plunge and figure out the finances later. So what I did was I did some consulting for about a year, and I intentionally took on clients that were startups themselves. So that way I got to help out folks that were maybe needing some engineering help but didn't have the budget for like a full-time engineer. I could come in, help out for a couple of months, and then they could put me on pause if they needed to. So that helped pay the bills. It also helped networking. It helped I still text some of the founder friends that I met in those times, bounce ideas off of each other. And kind of like I started charting the course. And then we talk about this in the book, but there got to be a point with Yembo when basically I treated that like a consulting project. And I said, okay, this is something that merits 5 hours a week, 10 hours a week. And there got to be a time where there was just too much going on in a day. We had customers asking for features on Yembo. I had these other clients that were coming around, and kind of realized it was time to dial down consulting and then dial up Yembo. So it looks now like, oh, clean transition, but what we actually did was kind of de-risked that jump and made it more of a gradual transition over multiple months instead of just like a aha moment where you just turn on a hairpin.
That's very interesting because we often hear about the process of learning, and it is a learning process. And indeed, you've written a book about it, trying to capture that learning. But what's interesting is also the way you've used other startups. So there's a kind of shared learning, a vicarious learning. How important was that network to you, particularly in the early days when, dare I say, you didn't know quite what you were doing, you were feeling your way?
Yeah, I think it's perfectly accurate. I will not dispute you on that. I would say it's tremendous, because when you're in a corporate job, there are departments and you have a expectation of your work. And usually, if the company is well managed, pretty clean lines around this is your team's responsibility, this is somebody else's. In a startup, you are got to realize the deck is stacked against you. The world has a way it works before you existed. So if you come in and you want to change something, time is not on your side. Is you need to convince people to change their behavior and adopt your product, adopt your way of thinking, adopt your mindsets. And by default, that will not happen. That is the nature of disruption, it's the nature of innovation, that you're coming in and you're changing the status quo. So if you have this employee mindset where, oh, I'm an engineer and there's a trade show coming up, well, I'll let the sales team handle that. Then momentum is going to get the best of you because you don't have it and you think you have it. And then people won't care about the product that you've engineered so beautifully. So I feel like the biggest thing that we learned there was that you're responsible for making the progress go forward. That is going to force you to do weird things that are uncomfortable that you've never done before in your career. And I don't think this will be a huge prize, but you probably won't be very good at it because it's your first time doing it. So if you listen to some of my first sales calls that were recorded, they're horrible. I talk too much. I don't ask enough questions. I cut off the prospect, things like that. But the thing to realize is you shouldn't compare yourself to an established professional in those fields. You need to be good enough to bring the company vision forward. I was never intending to be like a salesperson myself. I wanted to get it far enough that I ironed out the kinks in the product, and then you can bring in a professional salesperson. So I think that idea of being willing to be a beginner at something and do like a good enough job until you've got the process ironed out where you can bring on someone, it takes a lot of humility. I mean, because you have to do some really super embarrassing things. And if you're a professional in one area, you kind of get used to having a certain level that you operate at, and kind of going back to square one can be scary and uncomfortable. And I think having that network of other founders, um, they do it every day too. So when you talk to other employees at larger companies, you can kind of get looked at funny, like, hey, what are you doing? That's kind of crazy. But you talk to a founder, there's all these things they just get, and they're like, oh yeah, of course you need to do that.
Lovely, lovely. And one of the other things which I think is becoming increasingly recognized is we put a lot of emphasis on the front end. There are lots of boot camps to help startups. You come up with the idea becoming a solution, and you do all the tests and the prototyping, the MVPs, and all the rest, and you've got a solution. But of course, that's only halfway of the journey. You've then got to scale that. And that's the bit that isn't so well described. I wonder, could you comment, since you're on that scaling journey now, could you comment a bit about the challenges of scaling your innovation once you've got the solution at least started?
Sure. I would say there are two key challenges, one external and one internal in the company. I would say the external one is when your idea starts catching on and people start adopting, people start paying, they start using, maybe get your first referral. You get a lot of opportunities that come up. Is people want to take the product in different directions. Oh, it'd be great if you could do this, it'd be great if you could do that. And that is by nature because your startup at that point is very small. You're entering into an industry that's very big. So you have a lot of people seeing it for the first time. And it can be challenging to prioritize and understand what direction you want to have that be pulled into. So we were pretty strict in the early days. I will only talk to moving companies. People would say, hey, this is interesting. Can you do it for painting? Can you do it for plumbing? Can you do it for window washing or something? And we just didn't want to get distracted. So it was tough. I mean, you have companies telling you like, hey, I'll write you a check. Can you go for 6 months and customize everything and make it work for this use case? But we realized that not all dollars are accretive, where someone can pay you something that puts you on a path that's not where you want to end up. And like you need to have that vision internally of where you want to go. So I would say scaling involves selective discretion at which opportunities you take and which ones you shut the door to. And just taking the first one that comes up, I've not seen be a great strategy for selecting. And then on the internal side, there are a lot of decisions that I feel like are right to make when you're trying to just get started. Um, Most engineers I work with like to measure twice, cut once, be kind of cautious. But in a startup, if you have a big event in 3 months and the product doesn't exist yet and you want to put a demo together, you don't really have a whole lot of time for measuring twice and cutting once. So you do things that don't really scale. And that's okay up until a point, but then you can become a victim of your own success where the feature actually gets used and then people realize it's not built that well. And then the engineers want to tear it down, build it up again. So what we do and kind of learn the hard way is just plan on retooling all of the workflows, all of the processes every 6 months or so. And 6 months isn't like a line in the sand number that you have to adhere to. It's just kind of what we noticed looking back on how long it takes to outgrow something. We initially started with had our first dollars of revenue coming in. We said, okay, we want to hire some engineers. Did that, and my mentality at the time was, I don't have enough budget for quality assurance. I'm just going to make that a responsibility of the engineer. Looking back, I would say that's still the right call for a company that has 2 employees. But as you can probably imagine, there comes a day where you have 3 employees, 4 employees. At some point, it becomes a problem, and then you start having too many bugs. You start having the customers complaining, and we had to come in and figure out that workflow and put in a team dedicated for just making sure that the things that you're building are stable and they're being able to be maintained. And we saw it as like a blessing because at first you made a weird prototype. Some people had never heard of it before. They didn't know what AI was. Um, when you have customers complaining about bugs, that's motivation. They're using it, they're depending on it, they're expecting you to come through. So we were kind of proud when we were like, hey, this is going to be a problem. People actually depend on this now. They need it to work. But it was certainly something that came from monitoring the situation that we're in, like realizing, hey, this is going to just keep slowing us down. Our engineers are going to lose 2-3 days a week doing these other kinds of tasks. So we had to split off that kind of work and spin up a team for that specifically.
It certainly sounds like you've done a great deal of reflecting. You have some wonderful answers already. And thankfully, you've written it down in a book, which, as I say, is called Grow Up Fast. We will put a link at the end of the podcast. But If you could sort of distill some of the key messages, it would be very helpful, partly because you address the book to a very wide audience, from students through to practicing managers, would-be startups, and so on. There's also some very interesting challenges, some which empower others. That sounds a good one. Manage uncertainty. These are sort of labels from your book, but some others about feedback is dangerous. I was intrigued by that one. But could you sort of talk us a bit through the key messages of the book and how, perhaps with some examples, how you came by those key messages?
Sure. Yeah. So I wrote I believe you're reading the examples on the back. I got a copy right here. Um, so the idea behind this was I found a lot as the company grew. A lot of the folks that were working there, that are working here today at Yembo, weren't there in the early days, and I was concerned if I like waited until I was later on in my career to write down everything I had learned that I'd forget most of it. So I put together lessons from getting it off the ground along the way, just basically the highlights from it was 2016 when we were incorporated, and like biggest lessons learned from running an AI startup, getting your first customers, managing a team, all these kinds of things. And the best lessons I feel like I've learned were the ones where conventional wisdom was totally wrong. Um, and that's where the feedback is dangerous point comes from. And that is feedback is doesn't exist in its purest sense. There's a person who's giving it to you that has ambitions, they have motives, they have a background, they have a particular relationship with you. And if you treat all feedback as the same as I did myself and as I saw some of my other founder friends doing, you can put yourself on the wrong direction. For example, taking feedback from a client who is not going to purchase your product. It's a really good time to get good critical feedback when a sales opportunity is being closed. Um, what didn't resonate? The pricing was too much. There was this feature gap that was missing. Um, but that person has already decided no. So it's a signal, but if they tell you something that should like totally change the course of the business and you do that to the neglect of the clients that are paying you, you can put yourself in a sticky situation. So the point with feedback is not to blindly accept or blindly ignore it, but I feel like the point of feedback is understanding that relationship between who's the person who's giving it to me, what are my skills, what are theirs. A common one we saw in the early days was prospective investors who would give like design feedback or user interface feedback. And if we just rush to add every bell and whistle and button that they asked for, like you'd have a Frankenstein product that no one would want to use. Um, but if that exact same person were to give me business model advice or like management advice, they're a professional in that, or they're really good in that. So the feedback, it like exists in an ecosystem, and you can't just pluck it out of context and expect it to work. And by understanding that, I feel like we've learned some more, learned a lot of things along the way on that.
That's really interesting because so often the story is you have to listen to and learn from your whoever you're pitching to, whether it's investors or the market who you're trying to get to buy in. But it kind of implies an asymmetry, really, that you're always on the receiving end, take it all in. That clearly doesn't work because you just drown in the stuff that comes back to you. I liked your phrase about having some discretion there. I think that makes a lot of sense, and that's probably some very helpful advice to balance or at least modulate the feedback you're getting. Perhaps I could probe some more then, because these sound like rather interesting principles.
Sure.
Constraints are beautiful. I like the sound of that, but can you open that one up for us?
Sure. So this is a feeling I had. You come from a big multi-billion-dollar company to a rinky-dink startup with nothing, and it's easy to look at the things that you've lost. As I don't have a stocked fridge, I don't have all these perks, I don't have the ability to go to the person who invented the core technology and ask for feedback on how to use it, things like that. But what I found with constraints is they are very focusing. If I give you $100 million, or if I give you 100 million pounds, and I say, uh, you can do whatever you want, I think you would struggle to kind of figure out exactly what the best way to deploy that is. It's just going from zero to a huge number. There's just so many things along the way where if you gradually work your way up to there and you start with 1 million, 5 million, 10 million, you will learn to be a good steward of those things. You'll put processes in place. And by the time you get to that big, audacious number, you're kind of much better off. So we were seeing a lot of our business comes from trade shows. We go and we exhibit, and there are industry conventions, and it's a great way because movers are all over the world, so they all come together, and it's a great way to meet a lot of folks all at once. But then you go to these exhibits, and there are things like, oh, do you want the premium package? It's $100,000, and you get a better placement. And it was easy to look at like, oh, how can I stand up and compare to these other companies that have huge budgets? But what we learned about the constraints is it's kind of a non-starter. If my strategy is dependent on spending money I don't have, it's fantasy. It's not reality. So given that I can't go have a splashy booth with like a huge budget behind it, like what can I do? And what we came up with here is naturally the product had just launched. This is maybe 2018, 2019 or so. And people were curious when we were talking about it, but skeptical, right? Because they were like, hey, I've been doing it my old way for 30 years or so. Like, this is kind of weird. Are you sure it actually works? So what we found was like the booth is a great opportunity to debunk the skepticism. And so here's something I got to emerge out of a constraint. So we don't buy the premium booth. We get the cheapest 10 foot by 10 foot one, and it's not in a great spot. I think it's in the back corner by the bathroom. And we wanted to put some furniture in there so that people could come, take their phone, scan a video, and look at the items that were detected. But because we've got a budget, I can't afford to rent the furniture at the venue. They have like the prices are just absurd. I can't afford. I'd be able to afford like one chair, and it wouldn't be a very good demo. So we get off the plane. I call an Uber. I go to Walmart, and then we order some furniture. We call an Uber XL, the big van kind, and the big van picks us up. We take that back to the venue, and it was completely just because it was a cost saving thing. It was like 10% the cost of getting it at the venue. But what happened was people would say, "Oh yeah, well of course your demo worked. You got to pick the furniture." And I would hold up the receipt and I'd say, "Look, I bought this 4 hours ago. When I got on the plane, I had no idea what this was going to be. And I just went to the store and I bought things." And it really resonated with people, like showing the timestamp on the receipt. Like they're like, "Wow, it's cool. You can't cook that." So the kinds of conversations that we had, if we didn't have the constraint and we just said, okay, money is no object, I'll get a rock band, I'll put cool lights there, like you'll get people coming, but for the wrong reasons. And that I feel like having that constraint and not even bothering yourself about the things you can't do because you can't do them, it makes you kind of scrappy with what you do have. And that's what really moves the needle forward. So it's easy to complain about things you don't have, but I think just recognizing that cool things come from the constraints, it makes it a lot easier the next time around, where you focus your energies on what you can practically do as opposed to things that are out of your control.
Lovely. It's a great example. Thanks for that. Maybe can I pick one more of these because they are tantalising and great stuff to put on the back cover of a book. Harmony, not homogeneity. I like that one as well. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. There are not a lot of role models to look up to in an early stage company because there aren't a lot of people. And as the company starts to scale, there is a inevitable decision that the management must make around like who are the kind of people that we're going to hire, bring on, promote, all these kinds of things. And this was a phrase that initiated the first time I promoted somebody to a manager. I was trying to collect my thoughts and share them alongside the letter that said she was getting promoted, and to just share things that I have seen that work well with a team. Because what was happening was she was an individual contributor on a team working with me, probably had 4 or 5 other engineers. And as we were growing, she was getting promoted. She was going to run her own team. So she wouldn't be an individual contributor on mine anymore. She would have her own. And one of the dynamics that I saw, and this is something we like to do in general with any new process, is you write down what does it look like if everything's working well. And I was telling her, like, a sign if you want to check in and see if everything's going well with your new team is you're going to hire people with different backgrounds than you. Like for us, there's front end engineering, back end engineering, database design. I think most businesses can't function on just one discipline alone. You'll work with people with different backgrounds. So when you're hiring, when you're putting the team together, it's not just making a carbon copy of yourself and finding people with the exact same background as you that makes a great team. But you do want everybody to communicate clearly, get along well, have good psychological safety. So if you aim for homogeneity of like hiring people exactly like myself, it's probably easy to do because you can go back to your network, people you've worked with in the past, places you've gone to school, but you don't really end up where you want to go. So I found that rather than having just people with my background, having people that are able to achieve the company mission and bring their own unique dimensions on it. And if you look at the backgrounds of folks on our company now, there's a lot of people that came from non-traditional backgrounds. We have an engineer who used to work in customer support at Google. We have a designer who used to be a bartender. We have a software engineer who used to be an actress. So people have all these different backgrounds where they have so many diverse opinions and like places that they've come from that I feel like the end product is better for that because we're not all the same. We get along, we have the harmony, but we're not the same, so we don't have the homogeneity.
That's lovely and really speaks to today's diversity agenda, but in a very real way. Zach, there's some really great thoughts in here, and clearly the book is something that people should dive into. We're running out of time, unfortunately, so perhaps can I just focus in and give you the hard question to finish with, if I can?
Sure.
Thinking about people who might be thinking about starting up, and I'd include in that many people who have a social innovation in mind. They want to somehow make the world a better place, and they think they've got a great idea for doing that. Could Uncle Zach give them 2 or 3 best bits of advice for somebody at the beginning of that journey?
Sure. I think first off, know your why. Know why you're doing it. Startup road is long, it's hard, and the deck is stacked against you, as we talked about before. So whatever you end up doing, if it's just to make a quick buck, you'll probably lose motivation when it gets hard and when it gets long. So having a mission that you believe like really will make the world a better place is necessary to kind of power through the dark days. Um, I think the next one is if the idea is so good, find someone who's willing to go on that journey with you. Don't try to do it alone. Now, that doesn't mean necessarily that they have to be like your co-founder, but I think having advisors, having people that are in that journey with you, um, you'll be in weird situations. Stuff will come up before that you've never done before. So being able to bounce ideas off of somebody else, ideally someone who's been in similar situations, I think would be great. And I think the third is remember why you're doing it. It's a very rewarding thing when you get it right. And it's really easy to kind of lose sight of the smaller wins when you have so many things to do and you're so busy. So like make an effort to kind of look back, reflect, celebrate the wins along the way with yourself, with your team, because those kinds of things are motivating and it's a long journey. And if you look at people who do long, hard things like run marathons, you don't see them just like sprinting and motoring through. They pace themselves, they take breaks, and startup life is no different. So I think take the time to make sure that you're running a marathon and not a sprint.
Wonderful. That's 3 very valuable pieces of advice. Zach, thank you so much for sharing your insights. And I'd certainly recommend the book because it's full of much more of this. And it's also extremely helpful because we don't reflect enough. We're often far too busy doing. So I think the pausing and working out what's worked, the highs and the lows and so on, is really helpful. Zach, thank you so much for sparing the time, and all the best with Yembo and with your future entrepreneurial directions. But thanks for now.
Thank you, John.